This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. We're fortunate tonight to have as our guest my good friend Jim Bennett. Jim Bennett has had an illustrious career in Alabama politics and actually started as a reporter on Capitol Hill in the early 1960s. Jim has been a member of the House, he's been a member of the Senate, he's been Secretary of State for a decade, he's been Labor Commissioner for almost a decade, and he's been around Gold Hill for a while, so he knows all the politics of Alabama politics. So we're fortunate to have someone who knows the political scene with us today. And Jim, good to have you with us, old buddy.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's great to be here.
Jim Bennett started off at Jacksonville State. A lot of great politicians came from Jacksonville. Folsom came from up there. And you and Jim actually on the board together up there.
We are. We're good friends. He was lieutenant governor when I was in the Senate, and matter of fact, he appointed me Secretary of State when there was a vacancy when Billy Joe Camp left to become director of ADO after Guy Hunt vacated that office.
That's
right. Was governor.
But now you're chairman of that board now.
Well, I am. I succeeded a gentleman by the name of Pete Matthews.
You follow Pete?
That you know well, or knew well.
Jim, I tell you, Pete Matthews knew the most political stories. I wish I'd sat down with Pete and written down all of them he knew. I started compiling a list of political stories. I missed getting them from old Pete. He was a colorful character, wasn't he?
He was good. He never met a person he didn't like. He was a great politician because he could converse with anyone.
Talking about a great, he was a great speaker too. I had him speak to a club one time, and my people said that's the best speech we've ever had in our life. He knew the most political stories. One of the best ones that Pete was involved in was in the early, in the 70s. He was still chairman of Ways and Means in the House, one term in the 60s, when Wallace tried to raid the Education Trust Fund budget. Remember, it was about the early 70s, and Hubbard was made his spurs that day in denying Wallace the ability to raid that Education Trust Fund budget. And the story is told that Wallace assumed he was going to win that fight, and the vote came down. It was like 89-11 against him, not to bother the Education Trust Fund money. And Pete was chairman of Ways and Means and one of Wallace's floor leaders, and Wallace called him up frankly and said, "Pete, you got to move to reconsider." Pete said, "Governor, moved to reconsider nothing. We had lost 4 of our 11 votes." Have you heard that story?
Yes. The governor way back in those days, especially in the 60s, was all powerful.
He was.
I remember Pete, chairman of Ways and Means. He was also chairman of Finance and Taxation
in the Senate.
And he'd have a little piece of paper in his pocket that the governor had set down, and those were the bills that would be considered by the committee, by the Rules Committee. They just wouldn't bring up any other bills.
Jim, I tell you, this is true. You may remember this. You and I served in the House in '82 together before you moved to the Senate in '83. That's one year we served together in the House. Well, Wallace named our committees in that year.
Yes.
When I got there as a freshman, we all sat around and let Wallace, he put us on what committee we were going to put on.
Right. Well, you remember what changed all that was Fob James saying he was going to apply business practices to the Alabama legislature. And I think Fob really thought of the legislature as members of his board of directors or something. And, the governor never got that power back.
No, he never did. Once that changed and Wallace left, that was the last hurrah for the governor running the legislature. But I promise you, that was the funniest thing. I mean, remember he put John Casey, chairman of Rules, that one year you were in the House. You remember that?
Yes.
And then from up there at Cleveland County, and he reads my column up there and sends me emails all the time, doing fine.
Yes.
John Casey, you ever see?
Good friend of mine.
Yeah, he sends me emails about my column, and but he was chairman of the Rules Committee. And Wallace would actually send the agenda, and they would just rubber stamp it.
And they do that in Ways and Means Committee too. And the member would try to bring up a bill, and he'd look at he said, "Well, your name's not on here." the governor was very, very powerful.
Well, he'd been governor all the time.
Days, yeah.
One day, I'd got to know him as a little boy, Jim, when I was paging up there. By the time you started being our Capitol Hill reporter, I started paging in the legislature. And Wallace got tickled because I was a page, and he'd tell me the same story. He was a page. He'd say, Steve, you know, I was a page boy like you. We both were page boys, you know. Chauncey Sparks made me a page, and Mr. Bassett brought you as a little boy up here, you know. He would tell me the same story. And one day he would tell me that story, and he got looking at me. He says, Steve, how old are you now? I said, Governor, I'm not 12 years old anymore. I'm 30 years old. I'm your representative. He said, I've been governor all your doggone life, haven't I? It occurred to him he'd been governor all those years. Yeah. So, you know, it's like anything else, you get good at it. You know, he learned how to work the legislature.
That's
and
right.
He would have us out to the governor's mansion. You remember Bob didn't do that. Remember how remember how he'd have you out there and talk to you on the phone? He'd call me at home all hours of the night. Say, Steve, how's your daughter? Just put Jenny on the phone.
Oh, yeah.
She's in the 1st grade now, isn't she? You know, and that kind of thing. He'd remember everything about you.
He was a big telephone caller
that phone.
at night. One of my first assignments down here as a reporter for the Post-Herald was Wallace's inauguration speech.
In 62,
First
63.
one, yes.
I want to get into that. Let's get back to that and just go with your. So after you got out of Jacksonville, you went to work for did you go straight to work for the newspaper?
I did.
Right out of college.
I was the editor of the college newspaper.
At Jacksonville.
And
what was its name? The Gamecock?
The name of the college paper, it was called the Collegian back then.
Okay.
But they've changed it to something else.
But so you were editor, and then you came straight. Did you go straight for the Birmingham Post-Herald?
I did. Jimmy Mills was the publisher. He was a friend of Dr. Houston Cole, who was president of Jacksonville State then, and the president and I had a very good relationship. And he called him up and said, "Hey, I got a young man here I think could make you a good reporter." And Jimmy Mills hired me on the telephone, and so I showed up.
Was your first assignment Capitol Hill?
No, I covered City Hall for a while. Right, you know, during a lot of the civil rights.
Was Bull Connor on the city council and all that stuff?
Bull Connor was the police commissioner. Jabbo Wagner Senior, and Art Haynes was the mayor. And those were some tumultuous days.
It was what year would it have been in the 60s? When you
I was there from 61, 62,
covering the city council in Birmingham.
Yeah, and when I didn't cover the legislature, I covered Birmingham City Council and City Hall. And back in those days, it wasn't unusual to interview George Wallace, Bull Connor, and Martin Luther King all in the same day.
When you were splitting duties when you came with the Post-Herald. You were doing the Capitol some and the City Hall some.
And then finally it became
nothing but Capitol.
Nothing but the Capitol. But
what year did you change nothing but the Capitol?
I guess 64. I was down here all the time, but I was.
Now Clark Stallworth was down there with you too, wasn't he?
Yeah, Clark.
With the Post-Herald. Well, let's name some of those luminary Capitol. That was a famous group. You had Al Fox with the Birmingham News.
Right. You had Dan Dowf in Birmingham News.
Did the News have more readership than the Post-Herald at that time?
Yeah, the News was the largest paper in the state.
Still is.
Post-Herald was very vibrant, though. We had 6 editions of the Post-Herald back then. And they would cut off at different times. We had a Florida edition. The deadline was like 6 o'clock at night, and we'd run to 1 o'clock in the morning with new editions.
So you had folks in a lot of people in the Panhandle reading the Post-Herald down there?
Yeah. Post-Herald was a big paper. We had 2 or 3 reporters down here. I'm told now that covering the Capitol full time was just about 3 reporters. The Post-Herald had that many. Back in my days, Birmingham News probably had 5. They had Dan Down, Al Fox. They had Hugh Sparrow.
He was with the Birmingham News too.
Yeah, he was Birmingham News. Had Ted Pearson, who covered it for a while. Of course, the advertiser had Bob Ingram. Mobile had Bill Sellers, Mobile Press Register. There was a young man from Huntsville. I think his name was Bob Hollis or something like that. And you had Forrest Castleberry. He worked for the Alabama Journal. You had Rex Thomas from AP.
Yeah, Rex Thomas. He
You
was
had
one,
Don Martin from UPI.
Uh-huh.
Bessie Ford came in maybe shortly thereafter.
Who did she represent?
UPI.
UPI. Jim, go back now. So you were just a cub reporter, and you covered that gauntlet in the sand speech.
Yeah.
It was a cold day, wasn't it?
It was, and those majorettes in those short skirts, I'm sure they froze to death.
Tell our viewers about that day, that speech, Wallace's famous segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech in '63. Had you heard any rumblings that he was going to make that big a segregationist speech? And he'd won on that issue, obviously.
Well, he had, you know, he had
campaigned on that issue.
Had a tough campaign previously against John Patterson. And
swore he'd never get out segged again.
Well, that was the story. I'm sure that was very much on his mind. George Wallace had a knack for seeing how people were going, and he could do that. You know, he could play that angle. I think Governor Wallace matured a lot in office. You know, Bull Connor too. After they were out of office,
Did Bull Connor mellow? You got
they mellowed a great deal.
Never heard about Bull Connor. I saw it in Wallace.
Yeah,
I knew him, so I knew that he actually did his last term. His last term as governor was my first term in the House, that '82 term, and I actually represented his county. It was in my district.
Yes,
he voted for me in my district. He lived in Clyde, still voted in Clyde. Clayton.
He would, in his early days, '64, '68, I followed I went along the press planes and everything with Wallace in those campaigns.
They take all the Alabama press with them then?
Well, you know, if your paper would allow you to do that, yes. And you know, I went all over the country with him. He was a very charismatic, self-confident individual. About the only time I ever saw him flustered was when Curtis LeMay was announced as his vice presidential running mate. You know, bombs away LeMay. You didn't know what he would say.
Tell us about that, Jim. Tell it now. So once he won the governors. Let's go back to that gauntlet in the sand speech, if you don't mind, in '63. Get it chronologically. You're covering the Capitol. You're a young 20-something-year-old reporter. Had you heard any? Of course, he'd run his whole campaign on that, so you didn't think those words were that different than the campaign, or did you when you heard them?
Well, you know, I think that speech was written for him by
Ace Carter.
Ace Carter.
I think it was.
And, I'm not sure he knew what was going to be in that speech.
Is that right?
A week ahead of time. You know, it was a work in progress, but it was a statement that it was a sound bite that he knew that would resonate and be.
Did you know it was going to resonate when you heard it? Nationwide.
Well, you know, when you're that close to history,
you don't see it as much.
You really don't see it that way. You know, when I used to talk to Martin Luther King, I never dreamed he'd be the national figure that he became at that point in time. And gee, if I'd have known that all these people going to become so famous, I would have taken pictures, taken notes, and written a book. And but
you covered Martin Luther King when he was here in Montgomery then.
Well, in Birmingham.
When he was in jail in Birmingham?
Well, I was there when he was in jail in Birmingham, but I remember him coming up to Birmingham City Hall and talking. I asked him one day what he was going to do that day, and he said there was some demonstrations going on. He said, "We will not touch the hair of a white man's head." That's what he told me. But I wish I'd have talked to him more in depth when I had the opportunity.
Jim, going on forward, now I'm getting back up with the presidential. Wallace ran for president in '64, didn't he?
'64, '68, '72.
He really was not intending. He didn't really think he was going to win. He didn't have a running mate. He didn't have a party in '64. He was just out making speeches, really, wasn't he?
Well,
flapping around.
He was, but I think he surprised himself with how well he did in you know, Indiana and Maryland. Wisconsin,
bit him, didn't it?
Michigan.
He got bit by the bug,
He
President Bug,
did,
didn't he?
and then Madison Square Garden. I mean, the roof was coming off of that building, right in the middle of New York City. So he did touch some people's feelings at the time. He campaigned on states' rights, and he said once we used to be a God-fearing nation, now we are a government-fearing nation. And you know, some people today feel the same way, that the federal government is too involved in their daily lives. And I think what Wallace really did, he opened the door for Southerners to become president.
For Jimmy Carter.
For Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, for that matter.
That's true. Go back to that '68 race. He picked Curtis LeMay. Tell the viewers about it. He was kind of a loose cannon, wasn't he?
Well, he was. You know, he talked about using A-bombs to defoliate the jungles and things, and it, quite frankly, scared Governor Wallace as much as did
What did you saw him get under glue?
Well,
what happened? Give me an example of what he said.
Well, you could just see his eyes just you know, like, what the heck have I created here? He had to sign Joe Fine to be with him at all times. Just keep an eye on him, I guess, and to help, you know, run the campaign, coordinate it. But I'm sure Joe Fine could tell you a lot of good stories.
So LeMay was a loose cannon in '68. Well, now you weren't with Wallace. Then he ran again in '72.
That's right.
He carried 5 states in '68. Did you see that was coming? You saw it was coming, didn't you?
Well, it was building. You know, he had the strength. He got 10 million votes. Which was a lot, you know, it's a lot of votes. Wasn't enough to win, of course, but it was. It probably influenced things. I think Richard Nixon wanted him to be on the ticket. You know.
Oh, really?
To be the third party anyway.
Oh, yeah, help him.
Take away from Humphrey.
Now, Jim, in '72, well, you weren't with him when he shot, were you?
No, I had already.
You already gone.
I already left. I was.
You weren't in the legislature yet, though.
I was elected to the legislature in '78.
Oh, but this was like '72. He was shot.
Right, right.
And so you were still with the paper, weren't you?
No, I left the paper then, and
going to public relations.
I was in public relations, and I had an advertising firm for a while in Birmingham.
So then, where were you when he was shot? Then you were you were in that business then?
Yes, I was in that business.
What was your first thought?
Well, gee, I could have been there, and I would have been there. Where would I have been at that particular moment in time? Because I was always close by. I was at the stand in the schoolhouse door.
Were you there in the summer of '63?
Yeah.
63, wasn't it?
Right. I was on part of the Selma March covering that, especially as it came into Montgomery. Over at St. Jude. That's where it kind of culminated, you know. But sometimes I kind of feel like Forrest Gump. I mean, all these pictures, you know, that are now kind of part of history, and it's surreal, Steve. It's like a previous life, you know. I've been away from that life for so long. Now
Let's get that. Let's move into that life. You got into politics in '78. You were having a PR firm in Birmingham. You ran for the state house from Homewood, didn't you?
Well, I did. I had, you know, down when I was a reporter, covered the House and Senate, and especially in the Senate, watching some of the peculiar antics of the membership, even like they do today, and I said to myself, heck, I can do this. And so I did in '78.
Was it an open seat you ran for?
Yes. Tom Leonard was the incumbent, and he ran for Congress and got beat. But I ran for his House seat, and I had, back then everybody was a Democrat.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I was a Democrat all through the legislative, my 15 years in the legislature, and my first term as Secretary of State.
Right.
Then I switched parties and got elected Secretary of State as a Republican.
In '82, wasn't it?
No, 98.
98, I mean, yeah.
So that's not a easy thing to do, to change parties. I guess Fob James and I are the only two statewide elected officials.
I wrote that, and then I got a call from a lady in Ottawa County who said Jim Sullivan did the same thing.
Well, maybe.
So it's three of y'all, I think. I had written that you and Fob James, the only ones who had run as, had been elected statewide as a Republican and a Democrat. But she said that Sullivan had done it too. I left him out, and she was chastising me about it.
Yes, I doubt they will be done again.
No, it won't be. It's over now. But Sullivan did the same thing.
Yes.
But I didn't know it at the time. But going back now, you and I served 1 year in the House together. You had gone in '78. And did you have an opponent in '82 in the House?
I did.
So you got reelected. Then you ran for a Senate seat after they redrew the lines. You beat Doug Cook in '83. That's a pretty strong opponent.
Yeah.
For the Senate.
Well, we had reapportionment, and that changed things around.
All of us still ran as Democrats.
Yeah. Yeah.
It hadn't changed yet.
My House opponent in '82 was Charles Spear, who was a millionaire who had built Brookwood Hospital. And Doug Cook was on the reapportionment committee and had cut him out of his Senate district.
So he thought he might run against him for the Senate.
Yeah, he was going to run against Doug Cook. That's what his intention was. And when he couldn't do that, he ended up in my House district, and he decided then to run against me. And he spent a record amount of money to beat me.
In '82 or '83?
'82.
'82.
And we were fortunate enough to win. But I was the last Democrat elected from that district.
Changed after that.
It did.
In '83, you served. What district was you served a long time in the state Senate from '83 to '98, '94?
'93.
Okay, so 10 years in the state Senate.
Yes.
What was your district? Obviously, it had Homewood.
It was Homewood, and it went to Bessemer.
So you had some blue collar districts in there. You had some Democratic strongholds still.
Well, my Senate district was really a perfect district to have. It was about 45% black. It was
so it was a Democratic district.
It was a Democratic district. All you had to have is third of the white vote there in the district, and with the black vote that came, being
Democrat,
it was an ideal district. And I held that until they were about to reapportion again, and Jim Folsom knew that I wanted to.
You were going to run Secretary
of State, and when he suddenly became governor, he asked me, did I want to...
in 9th, right before you're going to run.
Right, would I take that appointment, because Billy Joe Camp was then going to leave Secretary of State and become a cabinet officer under Folsom in the ADO, in the Alabama Development Office. So I was appointed for a 1.5-year term, and then I was elected for 8 years.
Elected first 4-year term from '94 to '98 as a Democrat.
Yes.
Then you won in '98 as a Republican.
That's right.
Statewide. So you one of two or three, one of the other people who've ever been elected.
That's right. I wouldn't recommend that for just anyone to do, but the time had to be right. And
speaking of that, Jim, let me ask you this question. And before I say that, though, let me say this to our viewers. I don't think there's ever been a more conscientious or better serving Secretary of State than you were. You were there every day, you ran that office, and that's not been true of everybody who has been elected to that office prior to or after you've left. But you were there every day, 9, 10-hour days, 5 or 6 days a week. I mean, you really ran that office and did a good job as Secretary of State, and that's in good shape. You were there 9 years.
Well,
9 or 10 years, yeah.
Probably
one of the best Secretary of State states I've had.
It's, you're the chief elections officer, and that's a responsible position, and I think you need to...
You took it seriously.
Take it seriously.
Yeah.
Don Siegelman, was Secretary of State,
right.
And I thought he did a good job as Secretary
I've had folks
of State.
say that was the best job he ever did in one of his jobs as Secretary of State.
Well, I think it was at a time when he was really into making the job something important, and I think he elevated it somewhat. You remember back before that, they used to play musical chairs in those
Agnes
jobs.
Baggett
and they were usually women that would just swap those positions each time. Very outstanding ladies, but they didn't stay in one of those positions very long. They would go to another one. I think one of the highest honors I've ever received is when I was Secretary of State, to be elected national president of the National Association of Secretaries of State.
What year was that?
That was in 1999.
Right beginning of your second term.
Yes.
Jim, speaking of seeing, then you being one of the few people who've ever seen that transition from Republican to Democrat to Republican, would you have ever dreamed when you first started covering the Capitol as a 20-something-year-old cub reporter for the Birmingham Post-Herald, the transition or transformation of the partisanship of the state of Alabama and the Deep South, for that matter? When you think about when you walked in that Capitol in the early 1960s, every member of our congressional delegation, every constitutional officer, 95% of the legislature, every judge, everything was a Democrat. It's just reversed now.
Well,
it's just completely reversed. Every constitutional officer is Republican.
Right.
8 out of 9 of our members of Congress are Republican. We'll only have one Democrat when you include our 2 senators. Every judge, 19 out of 19. And it's just would you have dreamed that?
Well, no. At that time, you didn't. But as the parties began to change their outlook and their philosophy, a lot of people say, look, I didn't really leave the Democratic Party. It changed course and left me, and so I went over this way. And what really changed my mind, Steve, about switching parties was I was advocate for election reform. We had absentee ballot abuse. We had dead people on the voting rolls. We needed voter ID. There was election fraud going rampant in different places. You had sheriffs that would actually take home ballots in their trunk of their car overnight, and then they'd restart the count the next morning. Yeah. Things that you just don't do in modern day election practices. So I would advocate those things as a Democratic state senator, and I'd have fellow party members saying, look, if you don't stop this, we're going to get you in the next election. And it finally dawned on me that Republicans were supporting these initiatives while Democrats, or at least some of the leadership, was not. And so I decided I was in the wrong place. And then from that point on, it was, you're not going to get me because I'm not going to be here. I'm going to be in that other party. And we are going to affect election reform in this state. And indeed, we did crack down on absentee voter abuse, and we took off 150,000 names of dead people off the voting rolls.
While you were Secretary of State?
While I was Secretary of State, and people, some of those people were still voting, by the way.
Well, Jim, I tell you what, our time's about up. I hate that all of our time's been gone. We've had the best time talking about Alabama politics, and your time as a reporter and a state house member, a state senator, and 10 years as Secretary of State, and now almost 10 years as Labor Commissioner. Well,
it's been an interesting journey. I feel really blessed to have been given this opportunity, and I would close out this session by saying politics, Steve, is just temporary, and these folks come down here think they're going to make it a lifetime job, need to get a grip. People only give us that opportunity for a little while.
They do.
And we need to make the best of it while we're here.
Good point. I want to thank you again for being on our show, and want to thank you viewers for being with us tonight on Alabama Politics. Again, our guest has been Jim Bennett, former House member, former Senator, former Secretary of State, and now Labor Commissioner. Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
And thank you, viewers. Perfect diamond.
This has been Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, a production of Troy University Television. Opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of Troy University, its administration, faculty, staff, or students.